Naomi Evans pulled into the courthouse parking lot, the rhythmic thudding of her heart keeping pace with the sound of her car's engine. The overcast Atlanta sky loomed above, casting a gray pallor that matched her internal unease. Today wasn't just any day. The trial she was heading into wasn't just any trial. It was personal, and it was historic. As a prominent civil rights attorney, Naomi had fought many battles, but this one centered on the systemic racial profiling in law enforcement could be a landmark case for Georgia. It wasn't just about justice for her client, Marcus Howard. It was about every black person who had been seen as a threat, every life upended by unwarranted suspicion. Glancing at the clock on her dashboard, Naomi's stomach tightened. Late, again. She had spent half the night reviewing every fact, every argument. Today had to be perfect, but the burden weighed heavily on her. So much hinged on her ability to convince a jury and break through the biases that were as ingrained in the legal system as the very marble pillars that supported the courthouse. Naomi's fingers drummed against the steering wheel as she sat for a moment, gathering herself. She glanced through the windshield, noticing the cluster of reporters stationed at the front of the courthouse, cameras slung around their necks, microphones in hand, waiting like vultures for any scrap of drama. They weren't just interested in the trial, they were hungry for the controversy, the conflict, the racially charged tension that would feed their headlines. She knew better than to walk into their trap today. Grabbing her briefcase, Naomi chose the side entrance, her familiar route for avoiding unwanted attention. The courthouse was more than a building to her. It was a battlefield, a place where justice was theoretically served but often denied. And today, Naomi was stepping into the fight, armed with her knowledge, her conviction, and her deep understanding of what it meant to be black in America. As she approached the entrance, her heels clicked on the wet pavement, each step heavy with purpose. The air was thick with humidity, a physical manifestation of the tension hanging over the trial and over Naomi's spirit. She squared her shoulders, reminding herself that this wasn't just for Marcus. It was for every injustice she had witnessed, for the years of legal battles she had waged, and for the justice she believed in, even if it seemed out of reach. But she could feel it, the stares, the unspoken questions. What was she doing here? Even in her tailored suit, Naomi felt the weight of those who doubted her, who didn't see her as someone who belonged in this courtroom, in this world of power and influence. But that was what made today even more important. She was here to prove that black women not only belonged, they led. Just as Naomi reached the courthouse side door, the sound of a voice, sharp and authoritative, pierced through her thoughts. "Ma'am, I need to see some ID." Naomi's steps faltered for just a moment before she turned, her breath catching slightly as she laid eyes on Officer Mitchell Davis, standing rigidly at his post by the entrance. He was young, white, and his stance was aggressive, arms crossed, eyes narrowing with suspicion that seemed all too familiar. His hand hovered too close to his holster, as if prepared for a confrontation. Naomi instinctively straightened, adjusting the strap of her briefcase, her heart rate quickening, but she forced herself to keep her face calm. "I'm Attorney Naomi Evans," she stated, her voice steady, though she could feel the weight of his gaze sliding over her like an accusation. She pulled the lanyard from beneath her blazer, holding her badge up as proof. "I'm due in court for the Howard case. I don't have time for this." Officer Davis's eyes barely flicked to the badge before returning to her face. The skepticism in his gaze was blatant, as if her professional appearance, her credentials, meant nothing compared to the color of her skin. Naomi could see it, the barely concealed contempt, the assumption that she didn't belong here. He leaned slightly forward, his jaw tightening. "I'll still need you to answer a few questions," he replied, his voice low, but the threat beneath his words was clear. "We've had reports of suspicious activity, and we need to be cautious." Naomi's eyes narrowed, the blood rushing in her ears. Suspicious activity. The term was thinly veiled, but she understood the real message. To him, her presence here was suspicious. Her existence in this space at this courthouse was a threat, not because of anything she had done, but because of who she was. Her skin. Her identity. "I'm here to do my job," Officer Naomi said, holding her badge a little higher, trying to suppress the anger bubbling inside her. "Just like you." His hand inched closer to the cuffs on his belt, and Naomi felt her pulse quicken. The tension was thick, suffocating. This wasn't the first time she had been made to feel like she was out of place, but it was rare that the disdain was this overt. Davis didn't back down. If anything, his expression hardened. "Step aside, or I'll have to detain you." For a brief second, time seemed to freeze. Naomi's mind raced, her breath coming quicker. Would he really arrest her? For what? For being black at a courthouse? For daring to step into a space where people like her weren't wanted? The injustice of it boiled her blood, but she forced herself to stay composed. She couldn't afford to let this escalate. Not now. Not with the trial of her career minutes away. Detain me for what? Exactly. Naomi's voice was cold, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him flinch, if only for a second. Because last I checked, being a lawyer on her way to court wasn't a crime. Officer Davis's mouth opened, but no words came out. His grip on the cuffs loosened, but the animosity didn't fade from his gaze. Naomi could feel the hostility, the unspoken belief that people like her didn't belong here. In these spaces of power, she held her ground, refusing to back down. Not today. Then, like a lifeline, a voice cut through the tension. Evans. Naomi Evans. Naomi turned to see Lieutenant John Walters striding toward them, his face stern but familiar. Relief washed over her, but it was tinged with frustration. She hated that it took the intervention of another white officer to get her past the threshold. Officer Davis, Walters said, his tone sharp, eyes narrowing at the younger man. "She's an attorney. She's expected inside." Davis's expression faltered, his fingers twitching by his belt as he stepped back, finally lowering his guard. She fit the description of he began, but Walters cut him off. "Stand down," Walters commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Naomi's chest tightened as she walked past Davis without another word. She could feel the anger simmering beneath the surface, the injustice of it all gnawing at her insides. Even as she stepped into the courthouse, her mind lingered on the encounter. This trial was supposed to be about exposing racial bias, and here it was, right at the door, before she even stepped foot inside the courtroom. She straightened her back, her grip tightening on her briefcase. Today she would fight not just for Marcus Howard, but for herself, for every black person who had ever been told they didn't belong. The battle was far from over, and Naomi Evans was just getting started. The sound of Naomi's heartbeat thundered in her ears, her pulse quickening as Officer Davis' grip hovered dangerously close to the cuffs dangling from his belt. Tension hung thick in the air, a suffocating weight pressing down on the small side entrance of the courthouse. Naomi, ever poised, kept her chin lifted, but the creeping fear gnawed at her core. How many times had she prepared herself to face this exact moment? To be questioned, scrutinized, and belittled not for her qualifications, but for the color of her skin. "Step aside," Ma Davis demanded again, his tone leaving no room for argument. His eyes flickered with something between suspicion and righteousness, as if her very presence was a threat. Naomi's breath hitched, her mind racing. Time was slipping away, her client's trial minutes from beginning. The thought of being detained, of watching Marcus Howard face an unjust system without her by his side, spurred her into action. She raised her badge higher, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "I'm attorney Naomi Evans. I have a trial." "I said step aside," Davis cut her off, his hand grazing his cuffs now. Just as Naomi's patience wore thin, and the tension threatened to explode into something far worse, a familiar voice sliced through the charged atmosphere. "Evans. Naomi Evans." Lieutenant John Walters' deep, authoritative voice echoed down the hall. Naomi turned, relief flooding her senses, though tempered by caution. Walters, a seasoned veteran of the police force, approached with long, deliberate strides. He recognized her from their past encounters in civil rights cases, each one a battle she had fought with fierce determination. Walters, older and hardened by years in law enforcement, had always maintained a professional demeanor with Naomi, but never warmth. There was no camaraderie, only the begrudging respect of someone who knew her victories threatened the very system he upheld. "Lieutenant Walters," Naomi said, trying to mask the vulnerability she felt standing before Davis's unwavering hostility. Walter's eyes flicked between her and Officer Davis, assessing the situation quickly. His brow furrowed, and for a brief moment, Naomi saw the conflict in his gaze. He didn't want to intervene, but he had to. His loyalty to the badge ran deep, and even in this moment, Naomi knew Walters was not her ally by choice. He was bound by duty, by the rigid confines of protocol, not by any shared sense of justice. Officer Davis, Walters said, his tone sharp. That's Attorney Evans. She's here for the Howard case. Davis hesitated, his hand still twitching near his belt. His face flushed as the weight of the moment settled in. Walter's presence demanded respect, and despite his obvious reluctance, Davis stepped back, lowering his hand and giving Naomi a begrudging nod. But there was no apology in his eyes, only resentment and confusion, as if he couldn't fathom how someone like Naomi had earned the right to stand here, to challenge him. "Sorry, Mom," Davis muttered, though the words held no true remorse. Naomi swallowed her frustration, offering a curt nod to Walters. As she stepped forward, past the officer who had moments before threatened to arrest her, the relief she felt was tainted. This was not a victory. It was a reminder. A reminder that even when she won, she was never truly free from the systemic prejudice that shadowed every corner of her life. Walters may have intervened, but his reluctance spoke volumes. He would uphold the law. But that didn't mean he believed in her right to challenge it. As Naomi made her way toward the courtroom, the weight of the encounter clung to her like a second skin. She had prepared herself to fight for Marcus Howard, but now the battle felt even more personal. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Every creak of the wooden benches, every shuffle of paper echoed through the oppressive silence. Naomi took her place at the defense table, the weight of what had just transpired still pressing on her chest. She could feel the eyes of the jury on her, scrutinizing every movement, every breath. The stakes were impossibly high. Marcus Howard sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly together, his face a mask of quiet determination. His arrest had been as unremarkable as it was devastating. A black man standing in a predominantly white neighborhood, waiting for a friend, deemed suspicious by an officer who had decided Marcus didn't belong. "All rise," the bailiff called, and everyone stood as Judge Karen Holbrook entered. Naomi's gaze fixed on the judge, who had a reputation for showing leniency toward law enforcement. Holbrook was a woman of few words, but her ruling spoke loudly. Cases like Marcus's rarely found sympathy in her courtroom. It wasn't that she was overtly biased, but her history was littered with dismissals of racial implications, her judgments often favoring the officer's good faith efforts over the rights of the accused. Naomi's stomach churned as she sat down. She had fought cases like this before, where the system itself seemed stacked against her clients. Marcus's case wasn't just about his wrongful arrest, it was a symbol of the oppression Naomi had spent her entire career fighting. The prosecution wasted no time, painting Marcus as a loiterer with suspicious intent, though no evidence supported these claims. Naomi listened, her fingers tracing the edges of her legal pad, every word igniting the fire in her belly. She glanced at Marcus, his expression neutral, though she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He had been fighting this battle his entire life, just as Naomi had. When it was her turn to speak, Naomi rose slowly, her heart steady, her voice calm. She faced the jury, her gaze unwavering. This case is not just about what Marcus Howard was doing that day. It's about why he was arrested in the first place. She turned toward the arresting officer, her eyes narrowing. Officer Mitchell Davis, the same man who had confronted her just moments before outside the courthouse, sat stiffly in the witness box. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a nervous energy that crackled through the room. "Officer Davis," Naomi began, her voice low but firm. "You stated that Mr. Howard looked suspicious. Can you explain exactly what about him seemed suspicious to you?" Davis fidgeted, his eyes darting toward the prosecutor before landing back on Naomi. He was just standing there, looking around, like he was waiting for something. Naomi nodded slowly, her gaze piercing through his thin explanation. "So standing in a neighborhood while waiting for a ride, does that usually lead to an arrest, officer?" Davis swallowed hard. Not always, no. Not always. Naomi raised an eyebrow. But it did this time. Could it be, Officer Davis, that the only thing suspicious about Mr. Howard was the color of his skin? The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Davis shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Naomi didn't need him to answer. The truth hung in the air, undeniable. Naomi let the silence linger, then turned to the jury. Marcus Howard wasn't arrested because he was breaking any laws. He was arrested because Officer Davis made an assumption rooted in the same bias that affects so many black men in this country every single day. She paused, letting her words sink in. The jury shifted uncomfortably, and Naomi saw the ripple of doubt cross their faces. She had cracked the facade of Officer Davis's defense, exposing the prejudice at the heart of Marcus's arrest. As the trial continued, Naomi fought tirelessly, weaving together the evidence, the testimony, and the undeniable truth of systemic bias. Judge Holbrook watched with her usual detachment, though Naomi sensed something stirring beneath the surface. The courtroom had changed. The tension was palpable, and everyone knew that this case was more than just about Marcus Howard. It was about justice itself. When the jury finally returned with their verdict, the air was thick with anticipation. Naomi held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. We find the defendant, Officer Mitchell Davis, guilty of wrongful arrest. A collective exhale rippled through the courtroom. Marcus Howard's family wept tears of relief, and Naomi felt a surge of victory swell in her chest. But even as she embraced the moment, she knew the fight was far from over. This was just one battle in a war that raged on, a war against a system built on bias and oppression. As she gathered her things to leave, Naomi glanced at Marcus, who gave her a small, weary smile. He knew, just as she did, that the road ahead would be long. But for today, at least they had taken a step toward justice. The courtroom was still, the weight of anticipation thickening the air as Naomi Evans, the defense attorney, approached the witness stand. Her heels clicked sharply on the polished wood floor, each step measured, purposeful. Her heart raced not out of nervousness, but from a simmering resolve. She had been preparing for this moment for months, and now it was time to expose the very fabric of bias that had woven itself into this case. At the stand sat Officer Mitchell Davis, his hands trembling ever so slightly as they rested on the arms of the chair. His eyes darted across the room, catching fleeting glances from the jury, the prosecutor, and finally Naomi. The tension was palpable, as if the entire courtroom was collectively holding its breath. Naomi stopped a few feet from the stand, her eyes fixed on Officer Davis. She could see the unease in his face, the nervous twitch in his jaw, the way his hands fidgeted, and how his gaze couldn't quite meet hers. The same officer who had humiliated her at the courthouse entrance was now the key figure in Marcus Howard's wrongful arrest. The irony of the situation was not lost on her, nor on anyone present. Officer Davis, Naomi began, her voice steady but laced with a firmness that immediately commanded attention. You testified that my client, Marcus Howard, looked suspicious. Can you clarify what you meant by suspicious? Officer Davis shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. He was standing near the entrance of the neighborhood, looking around. He seemed out of place. Naomi nodded, stepping closer, her expression unreadable. Out of place, she repeated, letting the words linger in the air. In what way was Mr. Howard out of place, Officer Davis? Davis swallowed hard. Well, it was a quiet, upscale neighborhood. He didn't look like he belonged there. There it was. The familiar, thinly veiled prejudice. Naomi's pulse quickened, but her outward composure remained intact. Didn't look like he belonged, she echoed softly, her tone now tinged with incredulity. And what exactly does someone who belongs in that neighborhood look like? The courtroom grew even quieter, if that were possible. The jurors leaned forward in their seats, eyes locked on the exchange. Officer Davis stammered, searching for the right words. I mean, it's not about race. He was acting nervous. It raised suspicion. Naomi's gaze hardened, her eyes piercing through Davis's defense. Nervous, she repeated again, this time more sharply. Officer Davis, was Marcus Howard doing anything illegal? Was he causing a disturbance? Davis hesitated, the silence dragging on uncomfortably before he finally muttered, "No, ma am." "No illegal activity," Naomi reiterated, her voice now a blade slicing through the air. "Yet you arrested him. Why?" Davis fumbled, his face reddening. I thought he might have been planning something." "You thought," Naomi said, cutting him off, her voice rising ever so slightly, enough to carry through the courtroom. "You thought. Based on what, Officer Davis? The way he looked? The fact that he was standing in a neighborhood where, by your own assumptions, a black man doesn't belong." The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Officer Davis was visibly crumbling under the weight of his own words. He opened his mouth to speak, but Naomi pressed on before he could formulate a response. "Let me remind you, Officer Davis, that assumptions, especially those based on race, are not facts. And assumptions like the ones you made about my client are the very reason we are here today. You detained Marcus Howard not because of any crime, but because of the color of his skin, because in your eyes he didn't belong." The courtroom remained dead silent, the jurors visibly moved by Naomi's unwavering words. Even the prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Officer Davis's defense was shattered, and it was clear to everyone in the room. Naomi stepped back slightly, letting the gravity of her cross-examination hang in the air. When Naomi rose to deliver her closing argument, the courtroom had transformed. What had started as a straightforward case of wrongful arrest had turned into a stark reflection of the racial prejudices embedded in the justice system. Naomi stood before the jury, her presence commanding. She inhaled deeply, letting the weight of the moment sink in before she spoke. "This case," she began, her voice calm but powerful, "is not just about Marcus Howard. It's about something far more insidious. It's about the assumptions that were made about him because of the color of his skin. Assumptions that led to his wrongful arrest. Assumptions that Officer Davis himself admitted to on that stand." She paused, letting her words sink into the minds of the jurors. Every eye in the room was on her. Marcus Howard was standing on a sidewalk, waiting for his friend. He wasn't causing any trouble. He wasn't breaking any laws. Yet, because of Officer Davis's preconceived notions, because Marcus didn't look like he belonged at, he was arrested. This isn't an isolated incident. This is a pattern that black men and women face every single day. A pattern where our mere presence in certain spaces is seen as a threat. Naomi's voice swelled with emotion as she continued, her gaze sweeping across the jurors, urging them to see the broader picture. "We live in a world where a black man waiting for a ride can be arrested simply because someone assumes he's up to no good. Where a black lawyer, yes, me, can be stopped at the very courthouse where she works, just because someone assumes she doesn't belong. These assumptions erode trust, they erode justice, and they erode the very fabric of our society." She took a step toward the jury, her voice lowering, becoming more personal, more intimate. "We ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a world where people are judged not by their actions, but by the color of their skin? Or do we want to live in a world where justice is truly blind, where everyone is treated equally under the law?" The room was charged with emotion now, every person hanging on to Naomi's words. Judge Holbrook shifted uneasily on the bench, aware of the national attention the case had garnered, aware that this case would set a precedent. "Marcus Howard deserves justice," Naomi concluded, her voice steady but resolute. "But more than that, we deserve a justice system that holds everyone accountable, not just the people who break the law, but the people who enforce it." Officer Davis acted on his biases, and today we have the opportunity to send a message that we will no longer tolerate a system where racial assumptions dictate who gets arrested and who gets to walk free. Naomi stepped back, her closing argument hanging in the air like a verdict of its own. The jurors were visibly moved, some nodding subtly, others exchanging glances as the weight of her words settled over them. Hours passed as the jury deliberated. The tension was thick, every minute feeling like an eternity. When the jury finally returned, the room went silent, breaths held in anticipation. "We find the defendant, Officer Mitchell Davis, guilty of wrongful arrest." Relief washed over Naomi as the words echoed in the courtroom. Marcus Howard embraced his family, tears streaming down his face, and for a moment justice seemed to prevail. But Naomi knew that this victory was just one step in a much larger battle. As the courtroom emptied and she gathered her things to leave, she reflected on the road ahead. The fight for true justice was far from over, but today they had taken a step in the right direction, and that, Naomi knew, was how change began, one step at a time. As Naomi stepped out of the courthouse, the weight of the trial momentarily lifted from her shoulders. The sunlight reflected off the courthouse steps, but the light did little to ease the storm brewing within her. Victory was bittersweet. The jury had found Officer Mitchell Davis guilty of the wrongful arrest of Marcus Howard, but Naomi knew that the verdict was just one battle in a war that stretched far beyond these courthouse walls. As she moved down the steps, she caught sight of Officer Davis standing near the entrance. He was out of uniform now, blending in with the crowd but standing apart in his remorse. His posture was slumped, hands stuffed deep into his pockets, eyes cast downward, as though avoiding the judgment of the world or perhaps his own reflection. Naomi's eyes locked onto him, and she felt a surge of emotions rise: anger, exhaustion, and a fleeting twinge of pity. She had faced men like Davis her entire career, men who hid behind badges and authority, while their implicit biases shaped their every action. But today, for once, accountability had been demanded. She couldn't tell if it made her feel triumphant or tired. Davis noticed her, straightened awkwardly, and hesitated for a moment before stepping toward her. His face flushed with guilt, his eyes shifting from side to side as if searching for the right words. "Attorney Evans," he started, voice low and unsteady. I wanted to say I'm sorry." Naomi stood still, her expression unwavering, a far cry from the whirlwind of emotions beneath the surface. She waited, letting the weight of his words sink in, but she had heard these kinds of apologies before. They were all the same, hollow, without the will to truly change. Davis fidgeted under her silence. "I know what I did was wrong. I was just following protocol, but that's no excuse. I see that now." Naomi's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing slightly. Her voice, when it came, was steady but edged with steel. "Following protocol, Officer Davis, is not an excuse to let your bias guide your decisions. You didn't stop Marcus because he was a threat. You stopped him because of the color of his skin. You stopped me for the same reason." Davis winced, shame washing over his face. He opened his mouth to speak but found no words. Naomi took a step closer, her gaze never leaving his. "You think your apology changes what you did," she continued, her voice soft but cutting. "You think one moment of guilt erases years of prejudice that people like Marcus and I have faced. You didn't just ruin one day of his life, you ruined his trust in a system that was supposed to protect him. You put him in handcuffs because, in your eyes, he didn't belong there. And I..." Naomi paused, her eyes burning with intensity. "I almost ended up in the same situation, because I didn't fit your idea of who a lawyer should be." The street outside the courthouse felt still, the usual hum of city life fading into the background as Naomi's words filled the space between them. Davis's face grew paler, the weight of her accusation heavy on his conscience. He swallowed hard, his hands wringing together in helplessness. "I know," he whispered, barely audible. "I've been thinking about it ever since. It wasn't just Marcus. It wasn't just you. It's been God, it's been everyone. I didn't even realize it." Naomi's expression softened, if only slightly. She had spent her career fighting these battles, challenging the deep-rooted prejudices that men like Davis carried, often unknowingly. She could see the guilt in his eyes, but guilt alone wouldn't change the world, not unless it came with a commitment to action. "You didn't realize it because you didn't have to," Naomi replied, her tone measured but firm. "That's the privilege you walk with every day, Officer Davis. You get to choose when to notice. People like Marcus, people like me, we don't have that luxury." Davis nodded, his head hanging low. "I want to be better," he said quietly, the words filled with an earnestness that caught Naomi off guard. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, I know I haven't earned that, but I want to learn. I want to change." Naomi searched his face for any sign of insincerity, but all she saw was a man caught in the crossfire of his own awakening. She had encountered too many people who claimed they wanted to change, only to fall back into the same patterns. But something about Davis felt different. Maybe it was the weight of the verdict, the public shaming, or perhaps the exhaustion in his voice that signaled a genuine desire to confront his demons. Wanting to change is a start, Naomi said slowly, choosing her words carefully. But wanting doesn't fix the damage you've done. It doesn't erase the fear that people like Marcus carry with them every time they see someone in uniform. Davis nodded again, his expression one of painful understanding. I know, but I want to do the work. I've already started looking into anti-bias training programs. I know it's not enough, but… Naomi interrupted, her voice soft but firm. It's a step. But understand, this real change isn't about checking off boxes or attending seminars. It's about confronting the biases that live inside you. The ones that led you to see Marcus and me as threats instead of people. And it's about standing up to the system that allowed you to act on those biases without fear of consequence. The air between them was heavy with unspoken truths. Naomi could see that Davis was grappling with the enormity of what she was saying. His shoulders slumped under the weight of it all, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of determination, of understanding that gave her pause. I want to be part of the change, Davis said after a long silence, his voice steady but quiet. I don't want to be the person who lets this happen again. Naomi studied him for a moment, her thoughts racing. She had spent years fighting for moments like this, for people to wake up, to recognize the harm they had caused, and to commit to doing better. But she also knew that words were easy and promises could be broken. The real test would come in the days and years that followed. Then prove it, she said finally, her voice unwavering. Prove it to yourself, to the people you've hurt, and to the system you claim to want to change. Don't just talk about it, be about it. Davis nodded, his face set in determination. Naomi gave him one last look, her gaze filled with a mix of hope and weariness. Change doesn't come easy, she said quietly. But if you're serious, you'll find a way. With that, Naomi turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement with each resolute step. She didn't look back, but she could feel Davis watching her, standing there with the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The fight for justice was far from over, but today, Naomi had won a small victory. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was something. And in this long, painful battle for equality, sometimes that's all you can hope for, one step in the right direction. As Naomi made her way down the courthouse steps, she felt a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. The road ahead was long, and the battles would be many. But for now, she could take solace in knowing that, in this moment, she had made a difference.